In a world overflowing with noise, shallow takes, and information that evaporates the moment you hear it, Selenius Media exists for one purpose: to give you depth. Whether the subject is philosophy, psychology, history, science, artificial intelligence, literature, or the shape of the future, every series we publish is built on one idea: that thinking clearly is a form of survival. Our catalog spans dozens of long-form, story-driven shows, from Western moral philosophy for beginners to pioneers of psychology and psychiatry, from AI, an uncertain future, to the classical music giants. Each series is crafted to give you more than facts. It gives you the context, the conflict, and the human meaning behind the ideas that shaped our world. If you enjoy this program, explore the rest of our library. Every show is designed to stand alone, but together they form a larger project, a guided tour of the forces, intellectual, emotional, political, technological, that built the world we live in and the world we're about to enter. Visit the Selenius Media channel to discover new series, follow your favorites, and support the work that allows us to create long-form, high-fidelity educational storytelling. And please leave comments if you enjoy our shows. Now, let's begin. In the early 14th century, when Europe's universities were packed with monks and clerics arguing about God, logic, and the structure of reality, a quiet Franciscan friar from a small English village began to do something dangerous. He started cutting away at the grand systems of his time. It was not a physical blade he wielded, but a habit of mind, a principle that later generations would remember as a razor. Do not multiply entities beyond necessity. His name was William of Ockham. To later philosophers, he would become a symbol of intellectual sharpness, the man who helped strip scholastic metaphysics down to essentials, and who, in doing so, reshaped the background against which Western moral thought developed. William was born around 1285 in the village of Ockham, in Surrey. We know almost nothing concrete about his childhood. Like many boys with some promise in that period, he entered a religious order young. In his case, the Franciscans. The Order of St. Francis, at least in its founding vision, prized poverty, humility, and a life close to the people, rather than the wealth and power that had accumulated in parts of the medieval church. But if the Franciscans preached simplicity of life, the intellectual world William entered was anything but simple. At Oxford, where he studied and taught, the air was thick with complex metaphysical distinctions. The great schoolmen of the 13th century, Thomas Aquinas most of all, had created vast syntheses of Aristotelian philosophy and Christian doctrine. They spoke of substantial forms and accidental forms, of intelligible species received in the mind, of hierarchical chains of being that stretching from worms to angels. Young William learned all this, absorbed the methods and terminology, and then began to turn against it. The instinct that would define him was, at root, a kind of intellectual humility. When faced with some purported explanation, he kept asking, is this entity or distinction really necessary, or have we smuggled it in because earlier authorities used it? If you can explain how we think and speak without positing extra metaphysical furniture, why keep it? His later reputation as a kind of philosophical minimalist comes from this insistence on parsimony. Entities should not be multiplied without necessity. The slogan that crystallizes his method is not a direct quotation from his writings, but a faithful summary. It means not that the world is simple, but that our theories should not be more elaborate than the world forces them to be. One of the main fields where he applied this razor was the medieval debate over universals. Philosophers had been wrestling with this problem since antiquity. When we use a general term like human, what makes that term meaningful? What is it that many individual humans share that allows us to talk about them under one concept? Realists like Aquinas held that universals have some kind of real existence. Humanity exists as a common nature instantiated in Socrates, Plato, and you and me. Nominalists, at the opposite extreme, claimed that only individuals exist, and universals are mere names we attach to groups of similar things. Occam's own position is often called conceptualist. He denies that universals exist as real shared entities in the world outside the mind. There is no independent humanity in which all humans participate. There are only individual human beings. Yet he also rejects the idea that universals are mere breath and noise. In his view, universality exists primarily in the mind. When we experience individual humans, our minds form a concept that can stand for all of them at once. That concept is universal in its capacity to apply to many individuals. Words like human, tree, or justice then attach to those general concepts. The real world contains singular things. Our mental and linguistic tools allow us to speak generally about them. On the surface, this might sound like a narrow technical adjustment, but it has larger implications. By refusing to posit a realm of universals over and above individual things, Occam flattens the medieval picture of reality. There is God, utterly unique and simple, and there are individual creatures. This horse, that stone, this angel, that sinner. The intermediate layer of quasi-Platonic forms or common natures is cut away. This makes the ontology of the world lighter, more focused on particular beings. It also subtly shifts how moral concepts are understood. When you say justice or virtue, you are not naming a freestanding essence you could, in principle, contemplate apart from all particular cases. You are referencing a concept formed by the mind to track certain patterns across individual acts and agents. His razor also deeply shapes his approach to theology. Medieval scholastics had often been ambitious about what natural reason could show about God. Aquinas, for example, believed that by reflecting on motion, causality, and the gradations of perfection in the world, we could prove the existence of a single, purely actual, infinitely perfect God, and then go on to demonstrate many divine attributes, simplicity, eternity, immutability, and so on. Occam is far more cautious. He does not doubt God's existence. He is a committed Christian. But he argues that many of the elaborate metaphysical claims theologians make about God cannot be strictly demonstrated by reason. Logic can show that certain descriptions are inconsistent or that some ideas about God clash with others, but the inner essence of God's being escapes our conceptual net. This modesty about reason's reach leads him to draw a sharper line between what we can know by natural light and what we accept by faith. Doctrines such as the Trinity, the Incarnation, or the Eucharist's transformation of bread and wine into Christ's body cannot be proved by philosophical argument. They are known only because God has revealed them. Occam's work is full of distinctions between God's absolute power and his ordained power. In absolute power, God could have created very different worlds with different laws of nature and different connections between acts and consequences. In ordained power, God has in fact chosen this particular order with its specific regularities and moral structure. We know that actual order not by deduction, but by revelation and experience. Here we come to one of the most controversial aspects of Occam's moral thought, his voluntarism. Voluntarism, in this context, means grounding moral obligation primarily in the will of God, rather than in some eternal rational order independent of divine choice. For Aquinas, by contrast, the basic principles of natural law, do good and avoid evil, preserve life, seek knowledge, live in society, flow from the natures God has given us and can be known by reason. God commands them because they are good for creatures like us. For Ockham, the dependence is more direct. It is God's free decision that ultimately makes certain actions obligatory or forbidden. God could, in his absolute power, have tied salvation to a different set of commands, or set up a different economy of grace and punishment. There are some logical constraints. God cannot will contradictions, but beyond that, morality at its deepest level is an expression of a personal will. That thought is both pious and disquieting. It is pious because it underlines God's freedom and sovereignty. No standard of goodness stands above God to which he must answer. It is disquieting because it opens the possibility, at least in theory, that what we now call good could have been bad, and vice versa, if God had chosen otherwise. Ockham himself quickly adds that in this world, with this order, God has freely ordained. We can trust the commandments given in Scripture and church teaching as stable guides. God, being truthful and faithful, will not arbitrarily change the rules midstream. But behind this assurance lies a background image. The moral law is not the outflow of a rational structure built into the nature of things, so much as the decree of a loving but utterly free Lord. That background image feeds into how he thinks about conscience and moral responsibility. If morality is at bottom a matter of obedience to divine commands, then each person must pay careful attention to what they sincerely judge God to have commanded. Conscience, in his writings, has real weight. To act against a sincerely held, even if mistaken, conscience is to act against what one takes to be God's will, and that is itself a grave fault. At the same time, given that God's will is known through revelation as mediated by Scripture and the Church, Ockham does not endorse individualism in the modern sense. He still respects tradition and authority, but the structures of authority, in his view, are not infallible. There remains a last court of appeal in the informed conscience trying to follow God's commands as best it can understand them. His philosophical and theological stances spill over into politics in dramatic ways. During his lifetime, the Franciscan order was embroiled in a fierce dispute with the papacy over poverty. A radical wing of Franciscans, inspired by the literal example of Saint Francis, claimed that Christ and the apostles owned nothing, individually or in common, and that the ideal Christian life involved renouncing both property and legal rights to property. Popes, who presided over a church owning vast estates, were not eager to endorse this radical poverty. The conflict escalated when Pope John XXII condemned certain Franciscan positions. Ockham, examining the arguments, came to side with his order's radical wing on key points. He also began to question broader papal claims to authority. Summoned to Avignon to answer charges of heresy, he studied papal documents closely and concluded that a pope could fall into error and even heresy, and that the Church as a whole has ultimate authority to judge such a pope. In other words, papal authority is not absolute. It is bounded by Scripture, by earlier tradition, and by the rights God has given to others. For a medieval friar, this was daring stuff. His investigation turned into open opposition. Fearing arrest, he fled Avignon in 1328 and found protection with the Holy Roman Emperor Louis of Bavaria, who himself was in conflict with the Pope. From exile, Ockham wrote trenchant treatises defending the rights of secular rulers against papal overreach and arguing for limits on ecclesiastical power. He maintained that the Pope could not legitimately claim sovereignty over all temporal affairs, that emperors and kings had their own God-given authority, and that the Church's spiritual role did not entitle it to meddle endlessly in civil matters. He also emphasized the role of the community, both secular and ecclesial, in establishing and checking authority. No human office, however exalted, was beyond all criticism. For this, he was never fully reconciled with the papacy, and he likely died in exile, still at odds with Rome. This political aspect of his life ties back to the same temperament visible in his metaphysics. A mistrust of grand, unbounded claims, whether about being, knowledge, or power. Just as he trims down the ontological hierarchy, refusing a realm of universals between God and individuals, so he trims down claims of plenitude in the papal office. Just as he insists that reason should not pretend to map God's inner life, so he insists that no single human institution should pretend to speak infallibly about all dimensions of human existence. There is an ethic of limit running through his work, of acknowledging what we cannot legitimately claim, whether about reality or about control. From the perspective of Western moral philosophy, Ockham's contributions are partly direct and partly indirect. Directly, his voluntarist moral theology presents a vision of obligation as rooted in personal command rather than in built-in teleology. God's law becomes central. Moral rightness consists in conformity to divine prescriptions, and sin in disobedience. This outlook influences later currents of thought that see morality as essentially a matter of obeying a sovereign will, whether divine in classical Protestantism or human in some forms of legal positivism. The image of normativity as law, rather than as natural flourishing, gains strength through his work. Indirectly, his nominalism and parsimony help shift the overall atmosphere in which moral questions are asked. When universals are treated as mental constructs instead of extra-worldly entities, and when speculative theology is reined in, space opens up for more empirically minded investigations of human behavior and society. Later thinkers, from early modern empiricists to social contract theorists, will focus more on individual agents, their desires, their agreements, and their institutions, and less on participation in an overarching metaphysical order. That shift cannot be reduced to Ockham, but he is one of the figures who nudges philosophy in that direction. You can see his shadow, for example, in the way later debates about natural law break into two streams. One stream, inheriting more from Aquinas, continues to speak of goods grounded in human nature, intelligible by reason, and universally binding. Another, influenced by voluntarism, frames morality more as a set of obligations imposed by a will. In Protestant Europe, especially in Reformed theology, the idea that God's law is absolute, somewhat inscrutable, and binding simply because God has spoken gains emphasis. Later still, in secular disguise, something similar appears in the thought of philosophers who see morality as grounded in rational decision or contract rather than in the intrinsic teleology of human capacities. They would not have recognized Ockham as an ancestor, but he helped to dislodge the older, more organic picture. It is important, though, not to make him into something he was not. Ockham is not a modern secularist or a skeptic about God. He believes firmly in revelation and is willing to accept mysteries that seem paradoxical to reason because God has testified to them. His razor is not aimed at faith itself, but at what he considers unnecessary philosophical embroidery. He is quite ready, for example, to affirm that the Eucharist involves Christ's real presence, even if philosophical attempts to describe this presence in terms of substance and accidents go beyond what reason can secure. In that sense, his method can be seen as a kind of protective asceticism, a way of stripping away intellectual luxuries so that the core of faith and the modest achievements of reason are not confused. There is also, running through his career, a moral drama about loyalty and conscience. As a Franciscan, he took vows of obedience and wanted, at least initially, to be a faithful son of the Church. When he concluded that certain papal actions and teachings were unjust and dangerous, he did not lightly break with Rome. His flight from Avignon and his alliance with the emperor were serious, costly choices. In them, we see a tension that will recur in Western moral thought, the pull between institutional authority and personal conviction, between unity and protest. Occam's willingness to say, in effect, I must obey God rather than men, in a specific, concrete conflict, prefigures later struggles of reformers, dissenters, and conscientious objectors across different traditions. To grasp his significance for your listeners, you might invite them to imagine a conversation between him and someone like Aquinas on the one side and someone like a modern scientific naturalist on the other. To Aquinas, he would say, you have too many entities and too much confidence in reason's ability to move from creatures to their creator. Trim the ontology, admit the limits. To the naturalist who denies God altogether, he would say, you have not trimmed enough. You have cut away the very foundation of all being. His own stance is somewhere in between, a sparse, individual-focused ontology, a more modest role for reason, a strong emphasis on a free and omnipotent God whose will grounds the moral order. One practical fruit of his approach is a heightened sensitivity to how easily humans confuse their own conceptual constructions with reality itself. When moral philosophers or theologians build immense systems, it becomes tempting to treat every piece of those systems as equally real and important. Occam's razor invites a kind of discernment. Which distinctions are truly anchored in the phenomena we are trying to make sense of, and which are artifacts of our own ingenuity? In ethics, this can translate into asking hard questions about how many layers of theory we need between our basic experiences of obligation, guilt, compassion, and hope, and the philosophical frameworks we use to articulate them. In the centuries after his death, Occam's name would be remembered more for the razor than for the detailed arguments of his works. Yet behind that famous principle is a whole posture toward truth. Careful, wary of overreach, ready to accept that sometimes we must stop and admit that we do not know. In a moral landscape where grand narratives frequently collide, religious, ideological, scientific, his example suggests that one way to be responsible is to speak only as far as our lights truly reach and to distinguish sharply between what we can argue for and what we must simply receive or confess. For a series charting the evolution of Western moral philosophy, William of Ockham stands at a crossroads. Behind him lies the richly structured universe of high medieval scholasticism, where morality, metaphysics, and theology form one grand, interconnected edifice. Ahead of him lie the more fragmented landscapes of Reformation, early modern science, social contract theory, liberalism, and secular ethics. He does not cause that whole shift, but he helps loosen some of the joints. By cutting away metaphysical excess, he clears more space for later thinkers to explore the human world on its own terms. By stressing the primacy of will in morality, he helps reshape how obligation is conceived. By challenging unbounded claims to authority, he models a conscience that can simultaneously inhabit a tradition and resist it when necessary. In the end, this friar from Surrey does something very simple and very hard. He insists that we be honest about what we are positing, about what we can prove, about what lines we are drawing between God and world, between authority and subject, between concept and thing. That insistence, quiet but relentless, is a moral act as much as an intellectual one. It is why his work still matters, long after the disputes of Avignon and the quarrels within the Franciscan order have faded, and why, for your listeners, an episode on William of Ockham is not just a medieval detour, but a key part of understanding how our moral vocabulary became leaner, sharper, and more self-conscious about its own limits.
Midnight rails under silver moon, dusty boots on a winding road. A shadow's the only friend I've known since she packed up and let me go. Empty whiskey bottle on the seat, her laugh still echoes in my bones. Saddle's heavy with memories. I ride alone where the wind still blows. Nowhere else to be, nowhere else to be, nowhere else to be. Nowhere else to be, nowhere else to be, nowhere else to be. Sunrise paints the horizon gold, but it don't warm a lonesome soul. Every town I pass feels half her size. Every trail's haunted by goodbye. I whisper prayers to open skies, hoping someday my heart'll find a brand new path beyond the pain, where broken hearts can heal in time. Nowhere else to be, nowhere else to be, nowhere else to be. Nowhere else to be, nowhere else to be. Nowhere else to be. Nowhere else to be, nowhere else to be.